I only needed shelter. Then this silent workshop began telling my family's story.
She was 20 and homeless. No room. No family. No keepsake from her mother. Just a wool coat and $3 she had earned, polishing her grandfather's tools. And with those $3, she bought an abandoned wooden flute maker's shop outside Elkhart, in Concord Township, Indiana, erased from county maps in 1979. The north wall had separated from its sill. Rain entered through 3 holes in the roof. The county condemned it on October 14th, 2022, with demolition planned for the following spring. But inside the tuning cork of an enormous grenadilla flute, sealed for more than 30 years, waited a hidden chamber holding money, gold keywork, and a final unfinished song. Before we continue, if stories like this mean something to you, hit subscribe. And tell us in the comments where you're watching from. We love seeing how far these stories travel. June Mercer had been listening her whole life without knowing it. As a child, she could distinguish the knock of rain on the kitchen vent from rain on the maple outside her bedroom. She knew when her father's truck needed oil by the change in its idle, and when her mother was tired by the way a spoon touched the rim of a teacup. After her mother died, June began keeping small sounds because there was little else she was allowed to keep. Her father, Thomas Mercer, worked maintenance at an Elkhart instrument factory, repairing belts, lathes, and dust collectors after the day shift left. He came home smelling of machine oil and brass polish. He was not a man who explained sorrow. On difficult evenings, he set a kettle on the stove and remained beside June until the water began to tremble. The person who taught her what listening could become was her grandfather, Elias Mercer. Elias repaired wooden flutes in a narrow shed behind his house in Bristol, where the windows were filmed with linseed oil and the floor carried a permanent dusting of black wood. Every Saturday, Thomas left June there before sunrise. Elias would warm 2 biscuits on the iron stove, divide an apple with his pocket knife, and place a cracked flute joint between them on the bench. He taught her to roll grenadilla under her palm and feel whether the grain ran straight. He showed her how a long shell reamer could correct a bore without tearing the wood, and how a silver key cup had to meet its pad evenly enough that lamplight vanished around the rim. June was too young to use the lathe, so she sorted springs, wiped rods with an oiled cloth, and held a tuner while Elias adjusted cork depth by fractions no ruler could easily show. Near noon, he opened the back door and played 3 notes toward the fields. Chickadees answered from the fence line. Elias would wait, play the notes again, and write their intervals in a small ledger. A flute is only an empty piece of wood until somebody gives it breath. He did not mean that worth arrived from money or praise. He meant that patient hands could prepare a place for life, but they could not force life to enter. Elias died in February 2017, after a stroke left his right hand curled against the blanket. By the time June and her father reached his house, distant relatives had already emptied the shed. The reamers, mandrels, spring hooks, ledgers, and ebony blanks were sold in 2 cardboard lots. His bench went to a salvage dealer. The birdsong notebook disappeared without a receipt. Thomas remarried the following year. Marilyn Vale entered the Mercer house quietly, carrying pale curtains, labelled storage boxes, and a preference for closed doors. She never raised her voice. She moved objects instead. June's mother's blue bowl vanished from the kitchen. Photographs were placed in drawers. Thomas's work shirts were replaced with pressed ones he did not choose. When June asked where something had gone, Marilyn answered with another question until the original one seemed impolite. After Thomas developed pancreatic cancer, Marilyn controlled the appointments, the mail, and eventually the visitors. June was permitted 10 minutes beside his bed each evening. A radio played near the window loud enough to cover their whispers. Thomas's fingers moved once toward June's hand, but Marilyn entered with medicine before he reached it. He died on September 2nd, 2022. 11 days later, June came downstairs and found her mother's cedar keepsake box resting on the entry table. The brass latch had been forced. Inside, only a pale rectangle remained where a photograph had once lain. Marilyn stood beside the open front door, wearing Thomas's house key on a new silver ring. Rain darkened the porch boards beyond her. At her feet sat June's wool coat, folded over a grocery sack containing 2 shirts and a toothbrush. The will was on the table. June saw her father's name, Marilyn's name, and a signature that leaned too heavily to the right. The house, savings, vehicle, and personal property had been left to the surviving spouse. June's name appeared once, in a sentence stating that she had already been provided for. Marilyn pushed the cedar box toward her. "Your father left you nothing. Take your coat." 8 words. June looked at the staircase, at the worn banister her mother had polished with beeswax, and then at the cold fireplace where Thomas had once dried Elias's flute cloths. Marilyn did not look away. She did not apologize. Her silence completed what the document had begun. June placed the empty cedar box back on the table. She took the coat, the grocery sack, and the 3 $1 bills she had kept for years in the lining of Elias's old tool roll. Then she stepped into the rain. For 6 weeks, she moved east and west along the bus routes of northern Indiana. In South Bend, she slept 3 nights beneath a church stairwell until a custodian found her before dawn and showed her the women's shelter on Tut Street. In Mishawaka, every bed was full, so she spent 2 nights sitting upright in a hospital waiting room with her grocery sack between her shoes. She washed in library sinks and dried her hair beneath hand blowers that stopped every 30 seconds. The 3 bills remained sewn inside her coat. Loose change did not last as well. $2.14 bought oatmeal and a banana. 73 cents bought nothing. So she kept it until a laundromat owner let her sweep lint and mop the tile for a sandwich. In Goshen, she slept behind a feed store where stacked pallets blocked the wind. Frost formed along the edge of her coat sleeve. A freight train passed at 2:10 each morning, shaking the gravel beneath her shoulder. She learned which churches served soup without requiring identification, which bus stations locked their restrooms, and which security guards woke a sleeping person with a hand rather than a shoe. She never telephoned Marilyn. She never returned to the house. By the 6th week, June had reached Elkhart with 21 cents in her pocket and the 3 folded dollars still hidden in the lining. On October 24th, she entered the Elkhart Public Library to escape a cold rain. She chose a table near a heating vent and opened the county newspaper because it was dry and no one minded how long she sat there. A classified notice appeared beneath listings for farm equipment and estate lumber. Abandoned structure. Concord Township. Theft or transfer by kit claim. Former woodwind repair shop. $3 administrative consideration. Boyer assumes all like lively. Pit, pit, plit, plit, plit. Glue. tax arrears, and demolition order. Enquire county clerk. June read it twice. A faint photograph showed a low building beneath bare walnut trees. The roof sagged. One chimney remained. Across the weathered sign, barely visible beneath moss and peeling paint, were 4 words: Mercer, woodwind and flute. Her hand settled over the stitched lining of her coat. Outside, buses hissed along Main Street, sending dirty water toward the curb. The county offices would close in 40 minutes. June copied the address onto the back of a discarded checkout slip, returned the newspaper to its wooden rod, and began walking through the rain. By sunset, the $3 would no longer belong to her. June reached the clerk's office with 9 minutes remaining before closing. The next morning, a county bus carried her south along US 33, past instrument factories, used car lots, and fields flattened by November rain. The driver let her off near Dunlap, though the property lay another 7 miles east. She walked until darkness covered the drainage ditches, then slept in a hay barn whose owner never knew she was there. The temperature fell to 28 degrees. She pushed loose hay beneath her coat and woke whenever mice moved inside the walls. At first light, she followed County Road 20 toward a settlement that seemed to have gathered itself around traffic rather than a town square. She passed Martin's Feed and Grain, Klein's Tire Service, the Bluebird Cafe, Weaver Hardware, and a narrow brick storefront called Hartman's Clock Repair. Their signs were faded but tended. Someone had swept each threshold before breakfast. The county clerk's office occupied the ground floor of a limestone building in Elkhart, beneath windows clouded by old storm glass. June entered, carrying hay in the seams of her coat. Behind the counter, a woman with a silver braid coiled tightly at the back of her head looked up from a stack of tax forms. A brass plate beside her blotter read MRS. Evelyn Pritchard, deputy clerk. "You came back," she said. June placed the 3 bills on the counter. Mrs. Pritchard studied them without touching them. One was creased nearly white across Washington's face. Another bore a faint rust-coloured stain from Elias's tool roll. The clerk removed her glasses and folded them carefully. "You understand the deed transfers the structure as is?" "Yes." "Ma'am, you understand there are delinquent taxes of $41.12. "Yes." "Ma'am, you understand the demolition order remains active unless repairs begin before March?" "Yes." "Ma'am, you understand the county will not provide water, power, insurance, or shelter?" "Yes." "Ma'am." Mrs. Pritchard looked past June toward the rain running down the courthouse windows. "Do you have somewhere else to live?" June did not answer immediately. The wall clock moved once. "No, ma'am." The clerk turned the papers around. The deed described one rectangular parcel, 6/10 of an acre, bounded on the south by a drainage creek, and on the north by land once owned by the Stutzman family. The building was listed as a former instrument workshop with attached storage room, date of construction uncertain. June signed where the clerk placed a blue paper arrow. Her signature was smaller than her father's had been. Mrs. Pritchard pressed the document beneath a brass embossing stamp. The handles closed with a heavy, deliberate bite. When they opened, the county seal stood raised above June's name. The clerk counted the $3, placed them in a narrow drawer, and gave June directions. County Road 20 East. Turn north on County Road 13. After the concrete culvert, take the gravel lane beside the abandoned pump house. The building is a 1/4 mile in, beyond the second line of walnuts. June folded the deed inside her coat. Mrs. Pritchard had begun arranging the remaining papers when her hand stopped over the surname. Mercer. June looked up. The clerk drew the deed toward her again, not to take it back, but to study the legal description. She opened a lower cabinet and removed a ledger thick enough to require both hands. Its pages smelled of dust and binding glue. Elias Mercer, she said. Was he family? My grandfather. Mrs. Pritchard ran one finger down a column dated 1979. He filed the final closure notice on the shop. I was a records assistant then. She glanced toward June's coat, perhaps noticing for the first time how little luggage accompanied her. He came here with a wooden flute case under his arm. Wouldn't put it on the floor. June held still. He said the trade was finished because the factories could make instruments faster than one pair of hands. Then he asked us not to destroy the workshop records. Said somebody might need to know how the old measurements were kept. Did he own the shop? His father did. Elias inherited a share, but the taxes passed through several estates. Eventually the county took possession. Mrs. Pritchard closed the ledger softly. I assumed every Mercer had left. June looked at the seal raised beneath her signature. Not everyone. The clerk reached beneath the counter and produced a ring holding 2 iron keys. One was ordinary. The other had been filed thin enough to slip into an old warded lock. Front door and tool room, she said. The tool room key may not turn. Do not force it unless you know what is behind the door. June accepted them. Mrs. Pritchard gathered the $3, but did not place them in the cash drawer. She slipped them beneath a metal clip inside her desk, beside a photograph of a boy holding a trumpet. Outside, the rain had weakened to mist. June walked south until a produce truck stopped and carried her as far as the Dunlap traffic light. The driver, a broad man with a red wool cap, said little. Before she climbed down, he handed her half a loaf of rye bread wrapped in butcher paper. County Road 20 ran straight between harvested cornfields. The wind had room to gather there. June walked with her head lowered, following the white shoulder line until she found County Road 13 and turned north. The concrete culvert crossed a narrow creek stained brown by fallen leaves. Beyond it stood the pump house, roofless and wrapped in trumpet vine. A gravel lane disappeared behind walnut trees. An elderly woman in a tan barn coat was collecting mail from a roadside box. A black and white dog stood beside her. Phone front paw lifted. You headed to the Mercer place? The woman asked. June nodded. The dog approached and smelled the hem of her coat. Name's Pearl Eberly. This is Amos. The woman pointed toward the lane with 2 envelopes. He'll bark if the chimney catches fire. I'll come if he keeps barking. Thank you. Pearl studied her face. Then the grocery sack. There's a hand pump behind the shop. Water runs red at first. Keep pumping. She called Amos back with a click of her tongue and returned toward a white farmhouse nearly hidden by cedars. The walnuts formed 2 uneven rows along the lane. Their black branches held no leaves, only a few shriveled husks that knocked against one another when the wind moved. After the second row, the shop appeared. It was longer than the newspaper photograph suggested, perhaps 38 feet by 18, built of hand-cut timber framed around walls of faded red brick. The roof pitched low beneath curled cedar shingles. One stone chimney leaned slightly east. A boarded window faced the lane, and above the door hung a narrow sign whose gold lettering had nearly disappeared. Mercer Woodwind and Flute. The north sill had dropped enough to open a dark seam between brick and timber. Moss covered the lower roof. A length of gutter hung from one iron spike and moved slowly in the wind. June stood before the door until the cold reached through her shoes. The thinner key entered the lock. She turned it with both hands. Something inside released. The door dragged over swollen floorboards, opening only wide enough for her shoulder. Air came out carrying mould, mouse nests, gold ash, and the bitter sweetness of old linseed oil. Dust touched her lips. Somewhere in the darkness, a drop of water struck metal with a patient, hollow note. She entered the front room. Grey daylight passed through cracks in the shutters and lay across a counter scarred by circular tool marks. Broken flute sections covered the floor, their black wood split lengthwise from years of damp. Tarnished silver keys had fallen free and gathered near the wall like bent insects. When June moved, the boards gave a low complaint beneath her weight. The room tasted of rust and old smoke. She opened the shutters one by one. The hinges resisted, then surrendered with a powdering of red corrosion. Through the glassless frame she could see the walnut lane, the creek beyond it, and Amos standing at the edge of Pearl's field watching her. A narrow doorway led to the back room. There she found a treadle lathe beneath a canvas sheet, a bench fitted with wooden jaws, and rows of shallow drawers whose labels had blurred into brown shadows. One wall held long boring rods, each wrapped in oiled cloth. A cracked enamel basin stood beside a hand pump that no longer connected to anything. The locked tool room door waited at the far end. June tried the ordinary iron key. It entered halfway and stopped. She remembered Mrs. Pritchard's warning and withdrew it. By dusk, she had swept one rectangle of floor with a bundle of dried grass. She ate rye bread slowly, catching the crumbs in her palm. From a drawer she removed a roll of brittle felt and spread it beside the cold stove. Her coat became a blanket. The grocery sack became a pillow. The building shifted after dark. Wind entered the separated sill and moved through the rooms with a low wooden breath. Rain tapped the broken roof, struck the counter, and found a metal key cup on the floor. Each drop sounded the same note. June listened until she could tell the creak of the rafters from the movement of mice and the creak from the rain. A flute is only an empty piece of wood until somebody gives it breath. For the first 3 days, June learned the property by necessity. The hand pump behind the shop gave only air for the first 17 strokes. Then brown water coughed from the spout, carrying iron flakes and the smell of wet stone. Pearl had been right. June pumped until the stream ran pale enough to fill an enamel bucket, then boiled it in a dented saucepan she found beneath the counter. The outhouse stood beyond the creek under a leaning cottonwood. Its door had lost one hinge, and the seat was split through the centre. June repaired the hinge with baling wire and laid a sanded flute crate across the crack. At night, she counted 14 separate floor sounds inside the shop, 6 from loose boards, 3 from cooling timbers, 2 from mice, and 3 that belonged to the wind. On the 4th morning, she walked back toward the cluster of businesses on County Road 20. Weaver Hardware occupied a narrow building with tin ceiling panels and shelves rising beyond the reach of its rolling ladder. The place smelled of rope, kerosene, cedar shavings, and the faint mineral dust of open nail bins. Behind the counter stood a man with one cloudy blue eye and a thumb flattened broad from an old hammer blow. His name was Silas Weaver. He listened while June explained the deed, the demolition order, and the holes in the roof. His good eye moved once toward her worn shoes. "You have money for materials, 21 cents. Silas rubbed his flattened thumb against the edge of the counter. "That won't roof much." "No, sir." He opened a ledger bound in green cloth and wrote June Mercer across the top of a blank page. "I'll give you 30 days on necessities. No paint, no curtains, no foolishness. You work it down when you can." June stared at the line bearing her name. "I may not be able to. Then I'll learn something about judgment." From beneath the counter he took a grease-stained manual titled Repairs for the Rural Homeowner, printed in 1948. The cover had been reinforced with cloth tape. "My brother learned from that book," he said. "He died owing me $7, so I suppose it's available." June left with a chimney brush for $4.80, 20 feet of jointed fiberglass rod for $6.40, 2 pounds of roofing nails for $1.95, a canvas drop cloth for $3.10, stove cement for $2.60, and a used wire hand brush priced at 75 cents. Silas wrote each amount in the ledger. Back at the shop, June began with the chimney because heat would make every later task possible. She spread the canvas over the stove opening, tied it around the pipe collar with twine, and climbed the roof using a ladder. Pearl had left against the walnut tree without explanation. The cedar shingles bent beneath her knees. At the chimney top, she removed a rusted cap and found the flue narrowed by black glaze. The manual warned against pushing a brush blindly through a blocked chimney. June lowered a weighted cord first. It stopped 11 feet down. She returned inside, disconnected the stovepipe, and opened the clean-out door at the chimney base. A nest of twigs, cloth fibres, and mouse bones filled the lower chamber. She removed it by hand, then worked the wire brush upward until loose soot began falling against the canvas. From the roof, she fitted the round brush to one fiberglass rod and lowered it through the flue. Each section added 3 feet. She twisted clockwise so the threaded joints would not loosen, driving the bristles down and drawing them back in short strokes. The first pass released dry soot. The second brought brittle sheets of creosote that broke like burned sugar. By noon, her palms had blistered beneath the rod. By 3, the brush moved through the full chimney without stopping. She spent 6 hours cleaning the flue and another hour carrying the black waste beyond the creek. When she removed the drop cloth, a fine soot line marked the floor around the stove like the edge of a shadow. June sealed 2 cracks in the stovepipe with stove cement and waited until morning for it to harden. The first fire began with walnut twigs, curled shavings, and 1 page from an advertisement left in a drawer. Smoke rolled briefly beneath the stove lid. Then the chimney warmed. The draught caught, and the flame drew upward with a steady sound. Amos barked once from Pearl's field and stopped. June placed the saucepan on the stove. She boiled creek water, added half an onion Pearl had left on the sill, 3 potatoes from the same basket, and the last heel of rye bread. Steam clouded the nearest window opening. For the first time in weeks, heat reached both sides of her hands. She ate sitting on the floor with her back against the bench. Afterward, she entered the workroom properly. She began at the west wall and moved clockwise. There was a foot-powered lathe with a split leather belt, its iron centres still aligned. Above it hung 3 long gun drills used for boring wooden flute bodies, each one darkened with oil and wrapped near the tip in linen. A drawer held silver needle springs sorted by length inside paper envelopes. Another contained lambskin pads, hardened at the edges but still white beneath their wrappers. On the bench stood a dial indicator mounted to a brass arm, delicate enough to register movement smaller than the thickness of paper. Beside it lay a hand reamer with 8 polished cutting edges, a box of cork rings, and a wooden mandrel marked with ink lines at measured intervals. The largest object rested against the back wall beneath a collapsed shelf. At first June mistook it for a length of black pipe. It was a wooden flute body nearly 4 feet long, thicker than her wrist, made from dark grenadilla that had faded brown where sunlight once reached it. Most of the silver mechanism was missing. The tone holes had been plugged with wax, perhaps to protect them from moisture. One end held a broad tuning cork fitted behind a wooden crown. June lifted the flute. It was heavier at the head than its size justified. She set it across the bench and tapped the body with the handle of the wire brush. The lower joints answered with a clear wooden knock. Near the head, the sound shortened into a dull, crowded note. She rolled the flute across 2 parallel strips of wood. The head sank faster than the foot. June removed the crown and examined the cork assembly. Ordinary tuning corks were fitted around a threaded rod and positioned inside the head joint to regulate the length of the air column. This one had no visible rod. Instead, a thin cedar disc closed the rear face, its grain carefully matched to the surrounding wood. She pressed one fingernail along the edge. A seam appeared. The disc would not move by hand. June softened the dried wax around it with a cloth warmed on the stove, then inserted the narrowest silver spring hook from the drawer. She worked slowly, lifting one portion no more than the thickness of a fingernail before moving to the opposite side. The cedar released without cracking. Behind it was not solid cork but a hollow chamber. June placed the disc on the bench. Inside the flute, wrapped in oiled linen, lay 3 narrow packages and a small tin box fitted so closely that she had to make a loop from thread to draw it out. She did not open them at once. She wiped the bench, washed her hands at the pump, and fed another piece of walnut into the stove. Then she returned with the canvas dropcloth and spread it over the work surface. The first package contained tools. There was a miniature spring hammer with Elias Mercer's initials cut into the handle, 2 ebony burnishers shaped for keycups, a pad slick made from polished ivory-coloured bone, and a set of plug gauges graduated in thousandths of an inch. Each had been coated in beeswax and wrapped separately. The second package held raw material, 12 rectangles of silver sheet, 4 lengths of spring wire, 6 grenadilla billets no longer than her hand, and a roll of thin gold alloy. June touched the gold with one finger and withdrew it. The third package was lighter inside, rested an entire flute key system fashioned from pale yellow metal, every cup, arm, post and ring joined with remarkable economy. The keywork weighed less than the incomplete silver mechanism scattered across the floor. Its levers moved beneath June's fingertips without side play. Folded below it was a sheet of music paper covered in Elias's small notation. The heading read Dawn, East Walnut Line. Short phrases had been marked beside the names of birds: chickadee, robin, wood thrush, field sparrow. Between the staves, Elias had written breathing counts and suggested fingerings for a flute not yet completed. June set the page aside and opened the tin box. The first layer held coins wrapped in tissue. Beneath them were paper bills folded into groups and tied with cotton thread. At the bottom lay a military medal suspended from a faded ribbon. June carried the box closer to the stove. She counted on the clean canvas, making columns the way Elias had once taught her to sort springs. There were double eagles, each marked $20, $10 Indian headpieces, $5 half eagles, and silver Morgan dollars worn smooth at the cheek. The paper currency was older but usable, sealed against damp inside waxed envelopes. She counted once, then again. The total was $21,600. Not $21,500. Not an even inheritance prepared for a bank. $21,600. Measured and kept as deliberately as a bore diameter. The medal was a purple heart bearing the profile of Washington. On the reverse, beneath tarnish, someone had engraved Samuel E. Mercer, 1944. Under it lay a sealed envelope. June recognized Elias's handwriting before she touched it. The first line visible through the yellowed paper read, "My dear one, whoever you are." She placed the envelope beside the birdsong score. All evening, she repaired the wrapping around the tools. She returned each coin to its paper, tied the bills again, and laid the gold keywork on a square of clean linen. She did not spend anything. She did not open the letter. After dark, June carried the envelope outside. She crossed the lane and sat beside the drainage creek, where the water moved beneath a skin of reflected stars. The shop window behind her glowed faintly from the stove. Walnut branches leaned over the roof, black against the sky. She held the letter between both palms until the cold entered her fingers. A flute is only an empty piece of wood until somebody gives it breath. Morning came pale and windless. June sat at the workbench with the envelope before her and the stove ticking softly behind her. The paper had yellowed at the edges, but the writing remained firm, each capital letter slightly narrower than Elias's later hand. She had seen that same script only once, on an old label beneath a box of springs. It belonged to his father. She opened the envelope along the original cut. My dear one, whoever you are, if you have found this, then the Flute remained closed longer than I expected, and the shop has passed into hands I could not know. My name is Nathaniel Elias Mercer. In March of 1988, Dr. Harold Winstead at Memorial Hospital in South Bend told me the cancer had reached my liver and that time should be counted in months, not years. I came home that afternoon and sharpened 3 reamers because work was the only honest measure I understood. This trade began with Josiah Mercer, born in Lancaster County, Pennsylvania, in 1841. He came west after the war and opened a repair room near Elkhart in 1872. His daughter, Ruth Mercer, born in 1878, learned key fitting when most shops would not allow a woman beyond the accounts desk. Ruth's son, Samuel Elias Mercer, born in 1904, carried the work through the Depression and returned to it after serving in France during the First World War. Samuel's son was me, born here in 1926. My own son, Elias Nathaniel Mercer, learned beside me until larger factories and cheaper instruments took the orders one by one. The trade closed on October 3, 1979. After that date, the benches stood quiet for more than 30 years. My brother Samuel Edward Mercer did not return from Europe in 1944. The War Department sent his effects, his Purple Heart, and one folded flag to our mother. She kept the flag. I kept the medal because Samuel had polished keycups at this bench before he ever carried a rifle. The medal belongs beside the work, not because war made him greater, but because he had once been careful with small things. The money is not payment for finding this place. It is time. Use it slowly. If you intend to make wooden flutes, begin with wood seasoned no less than 7 years. Grenadilla must be warmed before boring, never heated above 120 degrees Fahrenheit, or the heart will check. Mix raw linseed oil with 1 part turpentine to 3 parts oil for the first bore treatment. Then let the section rest 48 hours before a second coat. Drill tone holes undersize and finish them with a reaimer, no more than 0.02 at a time. Seat lambskin pads over low heat, testing each key with cigarette paper until no light passes the rim. Do not hurry the cork. 1/16 of an inch can move the whole instrument away from itself. You will find gold keywork in the wrapping. I made it for speed, though I never fitted it to a body. Gold is softer than silver and must be supported at every long arm. If you use it, do not make it ornamental. Let it work. The bird notation is unfinished. At dawn in April, the chickadees answered in descending thirds, while the wood thrush held its last phrase longer than any person would dare. I believed those calls might teach a flute where silence belongs. Inheritance is not the object left behind. It is the unfinished task placed within reach of another pair of hands. A tool has no loyalty to blood. It asks only whether the hand holding it will be patient, exact, and willing to begin again. If you carry the Mercer name, forgive us for leaving too much unsaid. If you do not carry it, the work does not belong to you any less. Behind the shop, follow the creek east until the water bends around the split walnut. There is a stone marker beneath the roots. Light the old brass lamp before you move it. Some things should be found with a flame nearby. The house is not empty. It has been waiting. You are welcome here. Nathaniel Elias Mercer, November 11th, 1988. June read the letter twice. The second time she placed 1 finger beneath each line, as she had done when Elias taught her to follow measurements across a drawing. When she finished, she folded the sheets along their original creases, smoothing each bend with the side of her thumb. She returned them to the envelope but did not seal it. Outside, The ground was hard with frost. She followed the creek east. Water moved quickly around exposed roots and flat stones, carrying walnut leaves beneath a skin of clear ice. At the bend stood a tree split by lightning, bone half living and one half silvered by weather. June knelt beneath the roots. A rectangular marker lay under 2 inches of soil. She cleared it with her hands until lettering appeared. Mercer, keep the Bortrue. Beside the marker, lodged between stones, was an old brass lamp with a round reservoir and a chimney blackened by soot. June carried it inside, cleaned the burner with a strip of cotton, and filled the reservoir with kerosene from a rusted can near the stove. The wick resisted at first, then a small flame rose inside the glass. It was not bright enough to fill the room. It illuminated the workbench, the gold keywork, and the letter resting beside the unfinished flute. The metal warmed from pale yellow to amber. During the weeks before June reached the shop, strangers had kept appearing in small, exact ways. The custodian in South Bend had opened the shelter door before dawn. The laundromat owner in Mishawaka had traded a clean floor for a sandwich. The produce driver in the red wool cap had handed her half a loaf of rye bread without asking for a story. Pearl Eberly had left a ladder against the walnut tree and pretended it had always belonged there. Silas Weaver had written June's name in a credit ledger when she owned 21 cents. None of them had rescued her. Each had simply moved one obstacle far enough for her to take the next step. Perhaps someone watching this story remembers a kindness like that. A meal, a ride, a warm room, or one person who believed you before there was evidence. What small kindness did someone once give you when you needed it most? That night, June wrapped Nathaniel's letter, Samuel's medal, and Elias's tools in the cleanest section of linen. She placed them beside her felt bed, close enough to touch without rising. The brass lamp burned low until sleep came. The first snow came on December 2nd, 6 inches laid softly over the walnut lane before dawn. June read the roofing chapter 3 times beside the stove. The shop roof measured 38 feet by 18, with 2 slopes and enough waste at the eaves to require 18 bundles of cedar shingles, 4 rolls of felt, and nearly 12 pounds of galvanized nails. She wrote the figures in Nathaniel's margin, then checked them again before walking to Weaver Hardware. Silas placed an old roofing hatchet on the counter. Its square pole was polished bright, and the handle bore the initials H.W. "My father's," he said. "Bring it back sharp." A former roofer named Walter Keene arrived the following morning. He was 73, thin as a folded ruler, and missing the tip of his left ear from an accident he did not explain. When June asked his price, he climbed the ladder without answering. They stripped the worst shingles first, working from the ridge downward. Beneath the north slope, one rafter had split where rain had followed a nail for years. Walter taught June to sister it with a sound length of pine, clamping both pieces before driving bolts through staggered holes. For 11 days, they worked beneath skies the colour of tin. Walter snapped a chalk line across each course and showed June how to hold the hatchet low. One light tap set the nail. A second drove it. A third seated the head without bruising the shingle. "That nail's proud." June leaned closer. "Pull it." She did. On the 9th day, snowmelt entered her right glove and remained there until her fingers stiffened. Walter said nothing. He placed his dry gloves on the ridge and continued barehanded until she exchanged them. By December 14th, the final ridge cap lay straight from chimney to gable. June stood on the ladder while Walter tested the courses with the flat of his palm. When the next rain came, the pans inside the shop remained empty. January exposed what the first fire had hidden. Bricks on the eastern side of the chimney had begun to spall, their faces breaking away in thin red shells. Between them, the old mortar had softened into powder that fell whenever the wind pressed against the stack. June lowered every loose brick in a bucket rather than throwing it from the roof. At the workbench, she cleaned each one with the wire brush until the beds were free of dust. Walter advised her to rebuild only what had failed. Silas measured hydraulic lime and fire clay into 2 paper sacks. June mixed 3 parts lime mortar to 1 part fire clay for the section nearest the flue, adding water slowly until the mixture held a thumbprint without slumping. She dampened each brick before setting it so the old clay would not steal moisture from the joint. The work lasted 3 weeks. Most mornings stayed in the 20s. June's bare hands went numb every 15 minutes. Because gloves made the mortar joints clumsy, she worked until sensation disappeared, then held her fingers near the stove without touching the iron. When the ache returned, she climbed again. She rebuilt the upper 6 courses, replaced the capstone, and tooled every joint with the rounded end of an old spoon. Near the roofline, she inserted new flashing beneath the shingles and sealed the edge with roofing cement. On January 27th, she lit a small test fire. Pearl stood near the lane with Amos at her knee. Silas watched from inside, his flattened thumb hooked through a belt loop. June fed the stove 3 dry walnut splits and waited. Smoke rose cleanly from the chimney, bent east in the wind, and did not enter the room. Amos looked up once, then lay down. The floorboards had darkened beneath decades of soot and linseed oil, but most were sound. June lifted the worst planks near the north wall and replaced them with white pine from a dismantled granary. She trimmed each board by hand, leaving enough space for seasonal movement, then fastened them with rosehead nails Silas found in a wooden keg at the back of his store. The nails had been cut by hand, their heads irregular enough to catch the light differently. For the remaining floor, she rented a random orbit sander at $14 per day. The machine pulled hard against her arms. She made the first pass with 80 grit paper, moving along the grain and never allowing the disc to pause. The second pass used 120 grit. The third, with 220, removed the final raised fibres along the bench and stove. Dust entered every seam of her clothing. After sweeping twice, June wiped the boards with a damp cloth and waited for the grain to rise. She sanded those roughened fibres by hand, then applied the first coat of oil with a folded cotton rag. 2 more coats followed, each thin enough to leave no standing pools. The final coat cured for 48 hours while she slept in the back room and stepped only on boards laid across the threshold. The wood changed slowly from dark honey toward mahogany. One morning, the sander remained silent. June had woken with her hands shaking and the room narrowed around her. She walked to the marsh beyond Pearl's field and sat on an overturned bucket. A great blue heron stood in the shallows, bone leg hidden, its body so still that the creek seemed to move around a carved figure. June watched it until noon. She did no work that day. The following morning, she returned to the floor, sharpened a scraper, and finished the edge beneath the front counter. There were 8 windows in the shop. 3 had no glass. 4 were cracked from corner to corner. The last held one wavering pane, believed to date from 1788, green at the edge and marked by trapped bubbles. June removed that pane first, wrapped it in wool, and stored it upright beneath the bench. She rebuilt the missing muntins from straight-grained pine and set replacement glass on narrow beds of DAP 33 glazing putty. Silas showed her how to knead the putty warm, press it firmly against the rabbet, and draw the knife in one continuous stroke so the outer bevel met the sight line of the wood beneath. The first bead tore in the middle. June scraped it away and began again. Inside each sash, she replaced the rotten cord with 1/4-inch cotton line. She fed it over the pulley, attached it to the iron counterweight with a figure-8 knot, and tested the balance before setting the sash back into its channel. Where paint had sealed old joints, she used steam from the kettle rather than forcing the wood. The preserved pane returned to the eastern window. Its surface distorted the walnut trees into long wavering shapes, but it held the February light more softly than the new glass. On the final afternoon, June raised the last sash and felt the counterweight descend inside the wall. Outside, a chickadee landed on a walnut branch no thicker than a flute rod. It turned its black-capped head toward the open window and gave 3 measured notes. June did not reach for the birdsong score. She listened until it flew. The walls near the chimney had been opened so many times that no 2 patches shared the same colour. Behind them, the original plaster clung to hand-split oak lath by narrow keys hardened between the gaps. Horsehair still ran through the lime in dark curved strands. June tried 3 small repairs beside the flue. The first dried too quickly and cracked overnight. The second sagged from the lath. The third separated cleanly when she pressed it with her thumb. Silas brought an old feed bag from his attic. Inside was horsehair his father had saved from a demolished farmhouse. June washed it, dried it near the stove, and cut it into short fibres. She mixed lime plaster until it held the hair evenly, then pressed a scored scratch coat through the lath. A 3/8-inch brown coat followed and cured for 72 hours beneath damp cloth. The final coat was 1/8 inch thick, drawn smooth with a steel trowel, and softened at the edges to meet the surviving wall. She watched the last patch begin to pale. These patches will hold another 100 years. Doris Vale owned the Bluebird Cafe and wore her grey hair pinned with 2 yellow pencils. She began leaving paper bags on June's doorstep before sunrise. Some held biscuits and boiled eggs. Others contained soup sealed in jars with wax paper beneath the lids. June carried the empty jars back and placed coins beside them. Doris pushed the money across the cafe counter without counting it. In candles when the shop reopens. In early March, a teenage boy arrived on a green Schwinn bicycle with a splitting maul balanced across the handlebars. His wrists extended from a coat that had become too small, and his hair appeared to have been cut with kitchen scissors. He split the fallen walnut behind the outhouse into stove lengths, stacking each row bark side upward. When June offered him 50 cents, he closed her hand around the coin. "My mother said, about your grandfather. His name was Caleb Morrow. He returned on Saturdays without being asked." Reverend Boyd walked past the lane every morning at 7:10. He had a white moustache stained faintly by pipe smoke and carried no umbrella, even in rain. Each day, he tipped his hat toward June and continued toward the church. One morning, while she stood beside 3 failed plaster patches, he paused at the door. Steady hands. Honest work. Amen. Then he walked on. June postponed the cellar until February 11th. The door lay beneath the back room stairs, swollen shut and sealed by rust. When it finally opened, gold air rose carrying earth, mineral damp, and the dry smell of old apples. 7 granite steps descended to a 12 by 15-foot room with a fieldstone floor. At its centre rested a dressed granite slab, too regular to belong among the rough stones. A small craft mark had been carved into one corner, a flute crossed by 3 descending notes. June swept the slab clean but did not lift it. Under the 3rd step, something wooden caught the broom handle. She reached beneath the stone and drew out a small oak box darkened by damp. Inside lay a brass key whose bow had been shaped like a ringed tone hole. Beneath it was a tintype dated 1903. A young woman stood outside the shop before the walnut trees had thickened. She wore a long work apron and held a narrow hand reamer upright against her shoulder. Her mouth, eyes, and the line of her brow looked enough like June's that she carried the photograph upstairs before examining it again. On the back, written in faded ink, were the words, Ruth Mercer, daughter of Josiah, Edge 25, summer of 1903. June placed the key on the mantel beside the brass lamp. She tried it in the toolroom door, the front lock, the tin box, and every drawer with a keyhole. It fit none of them. There it remained. Snow withdrew from the shaded side of the shop in narrow grey bands. The creek rose loud against the stones, carrying broken twigs and last autumn's leaves toward the culvert. By April, pale walnut catkins hung above the lane and dusted the roof with yellow pollen. June decided not to make a full flute that spring. The restored lathe could turn. The long drills had been cleaned. The gold keywork waited beneath linen. But exact work demanded more than a repaired room and a willing hand. She chose one worn Morgan dollar from the cash and exchanged it through a coin dealer for enough grenadilla offcuts, pad leather, silver wire, and cork to practice on pieces no longer than her palm. She bored straight holes, cut test seats, and ruined more samples than she kept. The remaining coins stayed wrapped. The house was patient. So was she. 2 winters later, on December 7th, 2024, June finished the first flute made in the Mercer shop since the trade had closed. It was not the great grenadilla body that had held the hidden chamber. That instrument remained on the wall, its cedar disc fitted back into place. June's flute was smaller, built from a billet seasoned for 11 years and turned in 3 patient sections. She had bored each joint undersize, then worked the reamers forward by thousandths. The tone holes had been corrected one at a time against a tuner. Silver posts supported a simplified key system because June was not yet prepared to risk Nathaniel's gold. At dawn, she stood beside the eastern window and played the first note. It wavered, settled, and held. A chickadee answered from the walnut line. The interior no longer resembled the room she had entered through the swollen door. The white pine repairs had darkened into the older floor. 8 windows admitted clean winter light. Tools hung by use rather than size, and each drawer carried a new label written beneath the faded original. The stove drew quietly. No pans waited beneath the roof. June kept the walls plain except for Ruth's tintype, Samuel's medal, and Nathaniel's bird notation framed behind old glass. The brass key remained unexplained until the following spring. Caleb was helping June clear dead branches near the split walnut when his maul struck iron beneath the bark. They removed moss and found a narrow brass plate set into the living side of the trunk, nearly swallowed by 40 years of growth. At its centre was a keyhole shaped like a tone hole. June brought the key from the mantel. It turned once. A section of bark-covered wood released from the trunk, revealing a copper-lined compartment no wider than a music book. Inside lay a folded 48-star American flag and an envelope wrapped in oilcloth. The letter had been written by Ruth Mercer on May 18th,
We ask
While her brother Samuel served with an army hospital unit in France, she wrote that the shop had become quiet because the town was listening for casualty lists. Their father still opened each morning, though orders had nearly stopped. Ruth repaired instruments for boys training at Camp Taylor and refused payment from any family already waiting for a son overseas. She wrote that the flag had flown over the shop on the day Samuel's first letter arrived. "If he returns," Ruth had written, "we will place it above the bench. If he does not, keep it where the walnut can hold what we cannot." The Samuel named in Ruth's letter was not the later Samuel whose Purple Heart June had found. He was the first of 2 Mercer men given the name, an uncle who returned from the First World War with damaged lungs and lived only until 1923. The family had repeated the name as families sometimes repeated a promise. June refolded the flag along its existing creases. She did not hang it. She returned it to the copper compartment with Ruth's letter and fitted a new oilcloth wrapping around both. Samuel Edward Mercer's Purple Heart was carried to St. Joseph Valley Memorial Park on November 11th, 2025. June went alone at first light and placed the medal against his marker for the length of 1 hymn from the church bells. Then she wrapped it again and brought it home. The cash remained almost whole. June used $1 Morgan for practice materials, a $5 half-eagle to settle the oldest portion of Silas's ledger, and 2 worn silver dollars to purchase glass for the final display cabinet. Doris accepted no coin for food. Walter accepted only the sharpening of his father's roofing hatchet. The paper currency stayed sealed. The gold pieces returned to tissue. June placed them inside the tin box with a new inventory written in her hand. On the final page, she wrote, "For the next one, spend only what gives the work time." She fitted the tin box into the hollow tuning cork and replaced the cedar disc without fresh wax. So another careful hand could find the seam. The shop reopened without a newspaper notice. Doris pinned a white index card to the corkboard beside the cafe register. "Wooden flutes repired. Small work only. Mercer shop. County Road 13. The first customer brought a school flute with a leaking pad. The second brought a cracked piccolo inherited from an aunt. By the end of winter, more than 40 names had been written on a mailing list kept in a flour tin beside the workbench. June accepted only repairs she understood. Instruments beyond her skill were returned with the names of people who could help. Caleb left for trade school but came back the following June, carrying a plank wrapped in a bedsheet. He had carved a sign from walnut taken from the fallen tree behind the shop. The letters followed the old wording exactly. Mercer woodwind and flute. Below it, in smaller letters, he had added, "Daughters." June ran her fingers through the fresh cuts. There was only 1 daughter, she said. Caleb set the sign against the counter. "So far, They hung it beneath the weathered original, leaving both visible. That autumn, June began her own letter. She used Nathaniel's fountain pen and paper made from cotton rag. Before writing, she sharpened 2 reamers, swept the floor, and opened the eastern window to hear the walnut leaves. My dear one, whoever you are. She described the building as it now stood, but not as a possession. She recorded the new roof pitch, the chimney-mortar ratio, and the location of the preserved glass. She explained which lathe bearing ran warm, which drill wandered left, and why the gold keywork should remain untouched until a maker could fit it without vanity. She named Pearl, Silas, Walter, Doris, Caleb, and Reverend Boyd. She did not record Marilyn's name. Near the end, June copied the bird phrases into the margin and added the notes she had heard that first December morning. The unfinished score had begun to grow, not toward completion, but toward another season. A flute is only an empty piece of wood until somebody gives it breath. At dusk, she folded the letter but did not hide it. She placed it in the workbench drawer beneath Nathaniel's, where it could be found without breaking anything. Outside, the new sign moved slightly in the evening wind. Warm light crossed the repaired floor, passed over Ruth's tintype, and reached the great grenadilla flute on the wall. The wooden flute maker's shop waits. It has always waited, in the county clerk's office. Mrs. Pritchard retired the following year. While clearing her desk, she found 3 worn $1 bills beneath the metal clip beside the trumpet photograph. She placed them in an envelope marked Mercer deed and left it in the drawer for the next clerk. The bills had never entered the county account.